Good evening. Thank you all for joining us for this artful evening. It's wonderful to see all of you here tonight. If you could, please just take a moment to make sure that your cell phones are silenced or turned off before we get started. As we gather here this evening, we honor and pay our respects to the land on which we stand and its traditional stewards, the Anishinaabe, the Council of the Three Fires, which includes the Odawa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi, also known as the Ottawa, Chippewa, and Potawatomi tribes. We also acknowledge the people of African descent who were stolen from their land and separated from their families through the enslavement Holocaust, and pay reverence and respect to them for building this country's infrastructure and economy with no compensation or reparations to date. It is my honor to welcome Michigan photographer Emily J. Gómez to the KIA for this talk, and we are also so excited to have her leading a workshop in the Kirk Newman Art School this weekend. Emily earned a BA in Fine Arts Photography from Loyola University Chicago and an MFA with distinction in photography from the University of Georgia. Her work has been exhibited widely and is included in the permanent collection of the Zuckerman Museum of Art in Kennesaw, Georgia. Tonight, Emily will share her work in new cyanotype and will also address some of her recent series that explore Southeastern and Midwestern landscapes. I also encourage you all to stop by to see the selections from her series, Pocket Waterfalls, now on view in the school commons. On a personal note, as a native of Georgia, I was so excited when I first encountered this series and recognized several beloved sites from my childhood rendered so beautifully in blue. So I really encourage you to check that out as well. And please join me in welcoming Emily Gómez.
Thank you, Miriam. Hi, everybody. I'd like to thank Mary Whalen, Miriam Thomas, and Leslie Donaldson for inviting me to present a lecture and a workshop, and for arranging my visit. I'm very happy to be here. This presentation is going to take you through several years of my life in photographic work and concentrate on how I learned the new cyanotype process, how the process is done, why I started using it, and why I continue to use it in my work. I'm going to begin with a short introduction of myself and some biography, and then show you several series I've made in new cyanotype. My name's Emily Gómez. I'm from Bloomfield Township, Michigan, a suburb of Detroit. M&M grew up on 8 Mile, and I grew up 7 Mile Roads West on 15 Mile. I went to Detroit Country Day School, where my mom was a first grade teacher and my dad taught high school German. In the summers, my family would lead study abroad trips to Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. My parents gave my brother and me Instamatic cameras to record our experiences. These are a couple of the first images I made that inspired me to study photography. In high school, I started making black and white prints in the darkroom and really fell in love with the experience. I decided that I wanted to go to school for photography. So I went to Loyola University Chicago and earned my BA in Fine Arts Photography from Loyola University. While in Chicago, I met my husband, Ernesto Gómez. After graduation, we got married and we moved back to Michigan. And I went on to become the staff photographer for a metropolitan Detroit newspaper called the Spinal Column Newsweekly. I worked there for 5 years, and it was based in Union Lake, Michigan. In 2003, I was accepted to the University of Georgia and earned my MFA with distinction in 2006. I started teaching at Georgia College the August after graduation and was a professor of photography for 15 years. In May 2022, we moved back to Michigan and chose Lewiston as a place to live and start our lives as full-time artists and owners of our small business called East Twin Studios. My cyanotype story begins in Chicago in the year 1997. I took a history of photography class in my junior year of college and fell in love with the work of the pictorialists. They were photographers who hand-coded their own papers, used soft focus, and strove for more painterly-looking subjects and images. Before I saw the work of the pictorialists, I did not know that photography could be such a handmade process. The idea of hand-coding emulsions appealed to me, as did their romantic style. At the time I was taking a history of photography class, my professor nominated me for a summer scholarship. I took a class at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. When I looked through the catalog, I saw that a class on platinum palladium printing was being offered by artists Pradeep Malde and Roger Vail. This class ended up being the most important and influential class I ever took. I learned argyrotype, new cyanotype, and platinum palladium processes. All three were developed by scientist photographer Mike Ware. The ammonium system of platinum palladium printing was co-developed by Pradeep Malde. All were created as improvements on the 19th century processes. Concerning cyanotype, Mike Ware found a few drawbacks with the traditional process invented by Sir John Herschel and created a chemical combination that he believed worked better. I'm going to begin by talking about the traditional formula. Sir John Herschel invented the cyanotype in 1842. He was an astronomer, a scientist, a mathematician, a chemist, an inventor, and a photographer. I also refer to him as my boyfriend. The traditional cyanotype formula is in two parts. Part one is ferric ammonium citrate mixed with distilled water, and then potassium ferrocyanide for solution B mixed with distilled water. Together, you mix them in equal parts, solution A and B. Mike Ware created the new cyanotype because of problems he had with the traditional formula. He found that the printing times were slow compared to other alternative processes. The two ingredients are stored separately, and ferric ammonium citrate grows mold over time. The sensitizer is not always well absorbed by the paper. The print needs to be massively overexposed, and stained highlights can happen. His chemical solution was to replace the ferric ammonium citrate with ferric ammonium oxalate. It's more sensitive to light, it does not grow mold, it penetrates paper fibers more readily. The advantages are faster exposure times. My prints usually take around 3 minutes as opposed to maybe 12 or 15 with the traditional formula. 1 bottle of chemistry, and a shelf life of at least 4 to 5 years. Things that might be seen as disadvantages: it's a little bit more difficult to mix. It requires heating and grinding of chemistry. It can't be used with as many papers as the traditional. It's coated with a rod rather than a brush in most cases. It's more expensive. If you buy a kit, it's $24.95 for 100 milliliters. And it's slightly more toxic. Mike Ware says, though not dangerously so. So Mike Ware's new cyanotype formula is ferric ammonium oxalate, potassium ferrocyanide, ammonium dichromate, and then distilled water to make 100 cc's, and you use 10 grams of citric acid for a clearing agent. You can use digital negatives for the process, but I usually use 8x10 or 120 millimeter negatives. I still develop my negatives the way I learned in 1997 with Liquid PMK Developer and TF4 Fixer. This type of negative is good for alternative process printing because many of the chemicals used are sensitive to UV or blue light. The greenish-yellow negative results in a negative with a greater total range and greater contrast. So you can see that the negative itself is like a greenish-yellow. And this is a print. This is a look at some of the equipment you need to make a new cyanotype. Since you're working with smaller amounts of chemistry, you need a syringe to measure up the solution, and you use a coating rod rather than a brush to coat your paper. A brush soaks up a lot of chemistry, and you have a small quantity to work with. Step 1 is to use a puddle pusher or a glass coating rod to coat your paper. So you basically use the syringe to put down the chemistry, and then you push it forward and pull it back. Usually do around like 4 to 6 passes, depending on the amount of chemistry you have. The second is to air dry the print for 1 hour or to dry the emulsion with a hairdryer. And then third, you place your negative in a contact printing frame and expose it either in a UV light box or in the sun. You rinse it gently in running water for 20 minutes, and then you dry it on a line or a screen. This is the first new cyanotype print that I made, and though I ended up teaching new cyanotype to my students, I didn't use it in my own work until 11 years later. The reason being that I didn't have a project that I thought needed to be blue. Before I start discussing the blue projects, I'm going to introduce you to a body of work that I started when I was in graduate school at the University of Georgia. It's called Unearthed, and I did it between about 2003 and 2014. So the series Unearthed began in 2003 when I moved from Michigan to Georgia to begin graduate school. When I arrived in Georgia, I wasn't exactly sure where to begin with my art, so I thought back to a recent trip that we had made to England for a friend's wedding. While in England, we spent a day visiting some Neolithic sites like Stonehenge, Silbury Hill, and the Stone Circle of Avebury. The approach to the sites was breathtaking. I remember driving through miles and miles of rolling hills and meadows and feeling overwhelmed when first seeing the enormous monoliths. Just standing in the landscapes had a calming effect on me. When I looked at the photographs of the places I made later on, I thought about how many layers of history were present in the frames, how devoted the people who raised these stones must have been to their beliefs, and how fleeting our lives must seem in comparison to the lifespan of the standing rocks. I decided I wanted to recapture some of those thoughts and feelings in a series I would begin in graduate school. I remembered seeing a sign for the Etowah Indian Mounds as we drove south on 75. I didn't know what an Indian mound was, but thought it might be similar to the burial hills I had seen in England. The landscape was similar, and I had similar feelings of being overwhelmed by the scale of the mounds and the beauty of their position in the landscape. But when I reached the top of the Temple Mound, I quickly realized that I couldn't make the same romantic types of images I made in England, because when I reached the top, I saw this sign: any religious or spiritual activity performed in any manner is not permitted at mound area. Special First Amendment right area is provided with permit. See manager. I also saw what looked like a nuclear power plant in the distance. I wondered why people weren't allowed to perform ceremonies at a site that's sacred to the Cherokee and Creek, and why a power plant could be built so close to a place with such beauty and history. As I continued on with the series, I found more examples of these strange visual juxtapositions. A real estate company named after an Indian mound, a gazebo on top of a burial mound, a train track running through the Okmulgee National Monument in Macon, Georgia, a Cherokee grave in the middle of 3 highway intersections, a burial mound that was inundated by Lake Hartwell, a spiral mound in Macon that's being overtaken by trees because there's no money for its upkeep. When I first began this series, I would wake up at 3 or 4 in the morning in order to start my drive to whatever location I had been researching so that I could arrive during the best light. I remember arriving at this site in the Santee National Wildlife Refuge after a long, groggy drive spent listening to election coverage. When I stood on the ground, I felt revitalized. The variation in the light, the framing of the trees, and the wildness of the grasses on the mound all contributed to the sense of reverence I felt for the place at that moment. The experience moved me to want to find out more about the Santee Indians. I did some internet research and found the address of the chief of the Santee Indian Nation of South Carolina, William Coon. I immediately wrote him a letter to ask if there were any books about the Santee or how I could find more information. A few days later, I arrived at school to find a message on our office answering machine. It was a man who sounded just like Johnny Cash. It was the chief. When I called him back, he said that there weren't many books on the Santee, but he'd be happy to meet with me to talk about their history. We arranged to meet at the IHOP in Spartanburg, South Carolina, where he told me everything he could over pancakes. Later on, Ernesto and I did a more professional audio interview with him, and he allowed me to make his portrait. When I met Chief Kuhn, it was the first time I showed my work to a Native American person. I was a bit nervous about it. Since I'm not Native American myself, I was afraid of the possibility of offending people within that population, that maybe I didn't have the right to discuss these issues because they didn't affect me directly. When I talked to him about the ideas of my work and gave him a platinum print I made of the Santee Mound after our first meeting, he was pleased, and he continued to keep in touch with me and involve me in his research about the Santee Nation's roots. Meeting Chief Kuhn made me understand the importance of meeting more Native people and becoming involved with the community. I started attending Native American celebrations, where people would perform traditional dances and talk about their history, as well as their present lives. I began to gain a deeper understanding of the people who were related to the places I was photographing, as well as what the mounds were used for originally, how they were built long ago and in many cases occupied later by the nations we know today, like the Cherokee and Creek. There are a few different types of Indian mounds: temple mounds, burial mounds, and effigy mounds. This image shows an artist's conception of what a temple mound may have looked like in its heyday. This is the Niquosi Mound in Franklin, North Carolina. And this is the image of it that I showed you earlier. This mound was mostly likely built by the Mississippian culture peoples around 1000 CE. It was used for ceremonial purposes, and the religious leader of the community most likely lived in a house on top of the mound. Religious ceremonies and other events would have at times taken place on the platform of the mound, and at times in the plaza below. Sometimes burials happen within them, and sometimes they happen in smaller mounds within the area. The people who were buried in mounds were people who were considered powerful within the chiefdom. The Mississippian culture began to decline in 1540 when the first recorded contact with Europeans happened. De Soto, the Spanish explorer, and his men entered the area and brought with them warfare and diseases that Native people were not immune to. The Native populations we know of today are the distant relatives of the one who survived, the Creeks, Cherokees, and Seminoles. Today, Niquosi is considered a sacred place to the Cherokee because their ancestors found the mounds and made use of them after the Mississippians did. This map shows where the Mississippian people once lived throughout the Southeast and Midwest. In addition to the Mississippians, there were other mound building cultures in what is now the Midwestern United States. In 2005, I began reading about these sites in this book and used it to help navigate my way from Georgia to Michigan on the first long-distance solo road trip I would make for the series. These are some of the places I found. This is the Creole Mound, an Adena burial mound that features a spiral staircase to the top. It's in the center of South Charleston, West Virginia. This is the Camden Park Mound, an Adena mound that used to serve as a bandstand for the park that was constructed in the early 1900s, when a railroad was built between Huntington, West Virginia, and Ashland, Kentucky. The city of Marietta has a series of Adena earthworks within its city limits. This is a photograph of the county library, which is built on top of one of the mounds. This mound is in a park in the center of a residential area. When I made the photograph, some kids rode their bikes over the mound and disappeared into the tree. The Gómez Mound is a burial mound that stands within Mound Cemetery. In 1976, the Junior League of Marietta buried a time capsule on top of the mound. If I live to be 100, I'm excited to see what they pull out. There are a series of 6 Indian mounds in this downtown park. They've never been excavated, so their origin is unknown. When I arrived at this site, I looked at the information kiosk. In front of it, it said, Island Creek Mound, more information later. This is one of the first places I photographed where the mound I was looking for was no longer there. I walked into the elementary school to ask the secretary about it, and she told me that it was bulldozed when they extended the school, but they didn't really think it was an Indian mound. The Ohio landscape was of particular interest to me because my grandparents lived in Ohio and I spent a large part of my childhood summers there. My grandparents' farm was close to this site, the Gnadenhutten Cemetery. When I was a kid, the cemetery was overgrown. It was dense and dark with trees. I remember riding by it and my grandma telling me that it was an Indian cemetery. It scared me back then. It had an eerie feeling to it. Before I revisited in 2005, I read a historical account of the Gnadenhutten massacre, which occurred at this site. In the 1770s, the area was inhabited by Moravian missionaries and Delaware Indians who had converted to Christianity. They lived peacefully together there during the time of the Revolutionary War until 1781, when the Christian Indians and missionaries were forced from the area to a village called Captive Town on the Sandusky River. Living conditions were awful in Captive Town, and people did not have enough food. So over 100 of the Christian Indians returned to Gnadenhutten to gather food they had stored and harvest the crops they had planted there previously. In March of 1782, they were surprised by a group of 160 Pennsylvania militiamen who wrongfully accused them of taking part in raids in Pennsylvania. The Indians were rounded up and divided into two of the cabins that stood on the land, one cabin for men and one for women and children. Since the Indians were Christian pacifists, they did not fight back, but spent the night singing hymns and praying. On the morning of March 8, 1782, some of the militiamen entered the cabins and killed the Indians by hitting them over the head with Cooper's mallets and then scalping them. Altogether, they murdered 28 men, 29 women, and 39 children. The militiamen then looted the town and burned it. They buried the remains of the Indians in a mound on the south side of the cemetery. When I arrived in 2005, this is what greeted me. One of those standees that tourists can put their faces through. In this case, tourists are invited to pretend they're an Indian waving from inside a cabin. Kiowa Town was one of the last photographs I made before I started teaching at Georgia College. Kiowa was a Cherokee capital during the time of the American Revolution, when it was destroyed. Today, it is underneath Lake Kiowa, which was formed in the 70s in order to generate power for the Duke Power Company. This was another photograph I made by waking up at 4 in the morning so that I could arrive during best light. Once I began teaching, my working methods changed a bit, since my time to photograph came during school breaks and on weekends. There's something else that happened to Ernesto and I around the time I began teaching at Georgia College. Chief Kuhn invited us to Tuscaloosa, Alabama to join the Alabama branch of the Santee for a ceremony where we would be officially adopted into the Santee Indian Nation. The following day, we had a naming ceremony on top of the Temple Mound in Moundville, Alabama. Don Libner, a tribal elder, gave us our Indian names that day, and it was a very emotional experience for both of us. The following spring, we met Kathy Libner, the second chief and medicine woman of the Santee Nation. She and her husband, Don, came to our house to start teaching us the Dakota language, which is the language the Santee speak, and to show us how to build an inipi, or sweat lodge. An inipi is a structure that's built when someone wants to offer prayers to God. Stones are heated on an outside fire until they're red hot. The fire tender gives stones to the medicine man or woman who sits on the right-hand side of the lodge. He or she then places the stones in a pit in the center of the lodge, around which the participants sit. She pours water on the rocks to create steam after each round of prayers are offered up by the people in the lodge. The steam exits an opening at the top of the inipi and carries with it the prayers of the people inside. The inipi that we had was a healing ceremony. My grandfather had died that February, and it inspired me to start a new series about my grandparents. The first project for which I used new cyanotype was a series called Relics. I inherited some objects that belonged to my grandparents, the things that I wanted of theirs for the things that I most strongly associated with them and that I had memories tied to. I felt like part of my grandparents' spirits were retained in these items. The series felt right in Cyanotype because the associations we make with the color blue, the idea of being blue or sad, the ideas of sky, heaven, spirituality, calmness, and rest. I chose to print on vellum because of its translucent quality. The fact that you can see through it added to the ethereal feeling of the work. And this is an installation of a small part of it for an exhibition. I chose to hang it so that it sort of floated and you could see through it. I also started scanning family photographs and making cyanotypes of them. I wanted to give life to the people who were related to me but lost to history. When I felt that Relics had reached its conclusion, I looked back to Unearthed series and began thinking that the themes of my Relics work were really the same as the themes of Unearthed. I wondered if the cyanotype process would add to the meanings of the photograph, so I tried it. And I was happy with the results. This work fits with cyanotype to me because it's about history, remembering the past, the spiritual realm, the mystery of our predecessors on this continent, sadness, and mourning. And a few of these photographs are from a series that I did in 2010, just another extended road trip. This statue is dedicated to Chief Menominee, a leader of the Potawatomi Nation, who sought to maintain his people's right to live on their homeland. The Potawatomi Trail of Death, their removal to Kansas, began at this site. The Chief Menominee Memorial is the only statue dedicated to a Native American person that was funded by a federal grant. I revisited some negatives I had made in the past. As I printed, I decided that the photographs that were working best in cyanotype were the ones with strong contrast and atmosphere. I started printing the series in 2010, so I had around 8 years worth of negatives to work with. Each of the prints is displayed with an extended label about its history, and I'll just read you a few of them. Red Clay State Park in Cleveland, Tennessee features a replica of the council house at Red Clay, the seat of Cherokee government from 1832 to 1838. The council grounds were the last place the Cherokee Council met before their forced removal by federal troops under the command of General Winfield Scott in 1838. In 1977, the Army Corps of Engineers formed Carter's Lake on the former site of the Cherokee town Kusawati. This photograph shows the re-regulation dam built there. In 1838, the Cherokee removed from this area to nearby Fort Hutzel, where approximately 1,100 Cherokee people were held before their journey on the Trail of Tears to Oklahoma. Many Cherokee died in squalid removal forts, such as Fort Hutzel, before their forced marches could begin. The Miamisburg Mound, believed to be Adena in origin, is the largest conical mound in the state of Ohio, at over 6 stories in height and with a circumference of 800 feet. The mound and its surrounding land are preserved as a park by the city of Miamisburg and by the Ohio Historical Society. Fort Detroit, a fort controlled by the British in 1763, formerly stood where the intersections of Griswold and Larned Street stand currently. Ottawa leader Pontiac and his followers attacked the fort in an attempt to force the British out of the area that was home to Ottawas, Ojibwas, Potawatomis, Hurons, and other Great Lake Indian nations. 6 mounds, believed to be Adena in origin, are located on the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. A memorial to the Wright brothers stands nearby. And these are a couple that you've already seen, just in cyanotype. I ended up choosing 20 photographs to frame based on their level of contrast, variety of composition, variety of location, and the story behind each image. And this is a exhibition that I had in 2014, just to sort of see the scale. In 2014, I earned a faculty research leave for a semester off from teaching to pursue my work. Part of my research leave was spent at the Hambidge Center for the Creative Arts and Sciences, a residency center for artists, writers, and scientists. The residency gave me an opportunity to live in my own mountain studio for 5 weeks. I began my residency a day early because they were expecting a snowstorm in Rabun County. My first morning at Hambridge, we were snowed in. I used the opportunity to photograph with my medium format camera and make a small series of cyanotypes of my studio and the surrounding woods. The series is called Still Life. It's a series of tiny prints that are meditations on snow, trees, light, line, form, contrast, and quiet. On one of my days at Hambridge, I took a side trip to Anaruby Falls. As I hiked, I thought about what it must have been like for the people who discovered the falls. The approach to a waterfall is scary. The sound of water increasingly louder the closer you get to actually seeing it. The rushing water could sweep you away. There were a lot of things in my life at that time that felt uncertain and somewhat out of control. I thought about how photographing something was the only way you could hold on to it or have control over it. The idea of making a photograph of a waterfall and being able to put it in my pocket felt like the ultimate way of holding on to something awesome and uncontrollable. So I started photographing waterfalls and making cyanotypes from the negatives. The images are tiny. They're printed from 120 film, so they're 6 by 7 centimeters. I decided to put them in tintype cases so that you can literally put them in your pocket. The series is called Pocket Waterfalls, and they're displayed just out there if you want to go look at them. So this is a closed view of the case, and then an open view. I'm going to briefly talk about my latest work, which is a collaboration with Christa, Bowden, and Ernesto Gómez. It takes the three of us to really discuss the work in depth, but I wanted to show how the themes of my previous work tie into this work, and specifically about the cyanotypes that I made for the exhibition. This is an excerpt about the island from our artist statement. Cumberland Island is a barrier island about the size of Manhattan, located off the coast of Georgia. The island is one of 7 Atlantic coast national seashores and a part of the National Park System. Unlike most other barrier islands of the southeastern United States, Cumberland has escaped wide-scale development through expansive yet politically divisive preservation efforts to conserve the island in perpetuity. Cumberland Island is an ecological treasure comprised of 3 distinct ecosystems within its small geographic area: salt marsh, maritime forest, and beach, as well as many varied transition areas between these 3 ecosystems: an extensive freshwater pond system, wetlands, sloughs, and tidal creeks form essential habitats for wildlife, including threatened and endangered species, contributing to Cumberland Island's designation as an International Biosphere Reserve by the United Nations. Cumberland Island became a part of the National Park System in 1972, and Congress designated over 9,000 acres of northern part of the island as a wilderness area in 1982. Over 4,000 years of human history, including native Timucuans, Spanish missionaries, enslaved African Americans, and wealthy industrialists, also make up part of the island's history. Like other coastal areas, the Atlantic coast national seashores are incredibly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and some of the most acutely threatened parks in the National Park System. In 2016, during the National Park System Centennial, artists Christa Bowden, Emily Gómez, and Ernesto Gómez began a multi-year collaborative project to document the unique biome and history of Cumberland Island. With this project, they hope to expand the existing documentation of Cumberland Island in order to increase awareness of its significance and fragility, as well as to provide a record for future generations should the island be lost or irrevocably altered due to climate change or other threats. Another reason we began this project is because Christa has a special connection to the island, developed by spending time there with her mother and grandmother as a child. She asked us to join her on this artistic adventure because she knew we would be experiencing the island for the first time without any sentimental attachment. You can see by these three images that even though the three of us are in the same place, looking at the same views, we bring our own personal points of view and artistic styles. One of my contributions to the project stems from my work on Unearthed and my interest in showing people the invisible histories that are found in our landscape. Like just about every place in America, Cumberland Island has a complicated past. After a few years of photographing and studying the island, I set out to make some 8x10 negatives for cyanotypes. This area, which serves as a runway for small planes, was the site of Robert Stafford's cotton fields in 1800s. Also on the site are remnants of shell mounds and a low circular sand mound known as Stafford Airfield Mound. The mounds have been greatly reduced in size due to looting and agricultural activity. A series of chimneys mark the remains of 24 cabins that housed the enslaved people who worked Robert Stafford's cotton fields. This area is the site of a former Timucuan Indian village called Tacatacuru. In 1587, Spanish Franciscan monks built a mission called San Pedro de Mocama adjacent to the village. The mission prospered for nearly 100 years. In the early 1700s, the British under James Oglethorpe built 2 forts on the island. By the early 1800s, the Timucuan people perished due to European American expansion and diseases. In the late 19th century, the Carnegie family of Pittsburgh owned 90% of the island. Thomas Carnegie and his wife, Lucy, built Dungeness, a 59-room, Scottish-style mansion on the south end of the island as a winter getaway. The estate flourished until the 1920s and was left abandoned during the Great Depression. In 1959, a fire destroyed the mansion, leaving the ruins that we see today. To the west of the ruins of Dungeness Mansion stands a replica of a Carnegie-era statue of Mercury. The statue serves as a symbol of the opulent gardens and formal sitting areas that Lucy designed for her estate. In 1898, construction began on this mansion built for George Larder Carnegie and his wife, Margaret Thaw, as a wedding present from George's mother, Lucy. It was their primary winter residence until 1921 when George died. In the mid-2000s, legislation was passed to restore the mansion. Today, visitors tour the mansion to catch a glimpse of what life might have been like during the Carnegie's time on the island. The settlement is an area of land on the north end settled by freed African American slaves after the Civil War. The First American Baptist Church, first a log cabin, then rebuilt by community members in 1937, was one of the most important structures to the community. It's best known as the site where John F. Kennedy Jr. and Carolyn Bessette were wed in 1996. And this is the interior. Primus Mitchell and his wife Amanda are buried in High Point Cemetery on the north end of the island. Their lives began as enslaved people on Robert Stafford's plantation. In 1892, they lived at the settlement, where African American farmers had bought land. They were instrumental in building the first African Baptist church, where Primus was a preacher. They worked at the hotels on High Point and as field hands for the Carnegies during their lifetimes. In the 1870s, Cumberland Island served as a resort for tourists traveling through Georgia and Florida via train. As part of their journey, travelers could take steamboats from Brunswick, Georgia to Fernandina and Jacksonville, Florida, along the Cumberland route. Steamboats would dock here, bringing day trippers and vacationers to 2 hotels that were built on High Point on the north end of the island. The hotels prospered until the decline of railroad transportation. I've been printing with cyanotype for 17 years now, and I think it's safe to say that when I make a photograph with my view camera, I see it in blue before I see it in black and white. There's something about the tonal range and depth of a cyanotype that draws me in. In surveys, blue comes out on top as the majority of people's favorite color. Most of us are attracted to blue. A cyanotype feels rare and precious. It gives added emotional impact to subject matter, and even though it's in the cool color range, I feel warmth and quietness when I view a blueprint. To me, a cyanotype feels unapologetically like the work of the pictorialists. Thanks for listening to my talk. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit more about pocket waterfalls and the fact that they're in tintype cases and what that means and how that relates to the history of photography?
Sure. So pocket waterfalls in tintype cases and how that relates to the history of photography. So tintypes became very popular around the time of the Civil War. So before soldiers would go off to war, they would have a portrait made so that their loved ones could have a picture of them, and they often like kept it on their person. And that became just like almost like a piece of jewelry or something that they could, hold on to and look at. So it kind of like adds to the preciousness of the feel of the object. I just really, when I made those, I wanted people to be able to actually hold them, not to have to like be looking at it in a gallery, which is really hard to do, like practically. But I think the ultimate way I would like those to be seen was you go into a room and you open them and you look at them individually. So hopefully eventually I could come up with a solution for that. Any other questions? Yes.
To what extent do you spend time researching the areas in which you're going to photograph at a time versus going somewhere and choosing to put your camera and spontaneously take your photographs?
So the amount of time researching something as opposed to spontaneously photographing. You can probably tell my work takes a lot of research. And so the Unearthed work was always like a lot of research, and also like kind of started out by word of mouth. Friends would know that I was doing that, and they would say, "Oh, have you been to like the Sati Nakuchi Mound or something like that?" And they would tell me about it, and I would start going there, and it kind of fueled my interest, like just to know these places existed and people knew about them. And then the more I did it, the more it sort of turned into, kind of like my trips between Georgia and Michigan were always about like, what was I going to photograph along the way? So I had to do a lot of research, and I'm very into maps and like looking at maps and plotting things out. And I guess I'm a very kind of methodical person, which probably goes along with being an 8x10 photographer, because I like to take a lot of time, set things up, spend time looking at it. If I don't like it, set it up again. So yeah, a lot of time goes into that. The spontaneous aspect is probably happening more now when I live in northern Michigan, and I live really close to a lake called East Twin. And a lot of my work these days is just like, oh my gosh, the atmosphere on East Twin is so amazing. I'm gonna gotta get over there right now. So a lot of it for me, I think for every photographer, it's about light. You could probably see in some of the Unearthed work, the light wasn't always like fantastic because it was like I'm there and I'm doing it. But I think the spontaneity usually comes from just being really excited about what the light looks like on that day and trying to just have my camera with me when that happens. Yes.
How big a car do you have to carry an 8x10 around regularly?
How big of a car do I have to carry an 8x10 regularly? I have a Chevy Equinox, and before that I had a Scion XD, and it fits really nicely in the trunk. I like having a hatchback so that I can just open it up, and if I need shelter, I've got shelter. And it's not quite as complicated as wet plate photography, but it is nice to just like have a hatchback and a little place to setup. I also have a camera bag that is part backpack and part rolling suitcase. So I can either roll it with me if I'm somewhere that has some kind of a pavement, or I can put it on my back and carry it. So hopefully those days are going to be around for a little while. I know eventually I'm not going to be able to do that. So I'll have to incorporate my car into my process more. Yes.
Question. You did answer a little bit of it, but
Yeah.
I want more. The short question would be, how do you know where to stand when you're hauling around an 8x10?
That's a really good question. How do you know where to stand when you're hauling around an 8x10? I think it just comes from a lot of walking around when you get there. And I think it's something that you learn over time. You know, when I first started photographing with a view camera, I don't think I knew where to stand. And it's partially because you have to get to know your lens and how far you are from it, and like how close you can get and how far you want to be away from it. But the more you do it, the more you decide you're going to just walk around, and you actually try to find the best place before you get started, because you don't want to shoot a lot. Like, you know, the light's going to change, and you know that you don't want to shoot 25 sheets of film in one place because it's going to cost you like $180. So I think it just takes a lot of practice and a lot of like moving around before you set up.
You have to just get there and like roll in and stand there and like there you are.
Yeah, so
Without moving around, without.
yeah, like sometimes it just happens. Sorry, I'm like flipping through this really quickly. I'll tell you when I get there. Okay, so this picture, I had to set up really quickly because the light was perfect, and all I can describe it as like being a kid in the candy store, just like arriving somewhere and being like, the atmosphere is perfect and I can't miss it. And so, you know, maybe this wasn't the perfect place to stand, but it felt like it at that time. I was like, this is it. It's got to be in the center. Like, we usually don't center things in photography, but I was just like, this needs to be in the center. It's not going to look right if it's off. So this one happened like really quickly. And there's a few others that did too, but I think usually the quick setup has to do with the light. Any other questions?
The
Yeah.
pictures you did of your ancestors,
Yeah.
did you re-photograph them then?
No, so let me get back there. So these are, I think photographers always end up being the family archivists because they're like, you'll appreciate these old photographs. So I've got like cigar boxes and stuff full of family photographs. So I scanned this on a flatbed scanner, and I made a digital negative out of it. And it was like a very large 24 by 18. So I made like a really big digital negative on a printer, and then just took a really huge sheet of cyanotype, and I used a paint roller to like roll the cyanotype onto it, dry it, put this huge negative on it, and then I put it into a UV light box that was in the printmaking area of our school, because they use like bigger UV light boxes than we do in photography usually for like silk screening and things like that. So yeah, that was a process, and that was like a real learning experience, like figuring out the paint roller and how much chemistry to use and all of that kind of stuff. But yeah, these are all scanned photographs, and they're all like black and whites. This one was a cabinet card, and it was pretty cool because like the studio that it was done at in Switzerland, like the information is on the back of it. So I could conceivably go there and see where this happened. I like his mustache too. All right, well, thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. And yeah, if you want to see my work, it's out here. Thanks.